Welcome everyone to today's devotion. We are in Matthew chapter 2, a passage I trust that we're all familiar with, just not in the month of April. We are of course looking at the story, the nativity story of when Jesus as a toddler was visited by the Magi. A couple of things. First of all, Jesus was not an infant, he's a toddler. The text clearly says that the Magi saw Jesus in a house. And also Herod's actions for 2-year-olds and younger give added evidence that Jesus is not an infant. So that means that despite what we see all around the place around Christmas, the Magi and the shepherds were not together at the nativity scene. No, they were somewhere far off, perhaps traveling, but still far off, and hadn't seen Jesus yet. So sorry to ruin your Christmas, but you've got 8 months to get over it. And while I'm ruining Christmas, we don't know how many wise men there were. There could have been 3, could have been 300 for all we know. All we know is that there's more than one. The Magi there is plural, but we don't know how many more than one there was. And then you could add to that, they likely would have had some sort of entourage with them. Would have been safer to have something like that. And they may have had servants and aides and whatnot. We just simply don't know. Let me ruin your Christmas again. They're probably not from the Orient. We 3 kings of Orient are. They're probably from Persia or even from ancient Babylon. But that is something that we can discuss more around Christmas time. What matters most is what's happening in Matthew chapter 2. Remember, as we said yesterday, that the key issue for Matthew is that we see that Jesus is the King of the Jews. And this is demonstrated, first of all, by the visitation of the Magi. The Magi, as we said yesterday, are king makers. So notice what happens in these opening verses. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judah. Right away, what we have in opening up in this chapter is a contrast between 2 kings. The Magi want to know, where is the King of the Jews? And now Herod rightly could say, I'm the King of the Jews. Now technically, he's not a king. Virtually everyone lets him pretend he is king, but he's not actually a king. He thinks he has a dynasty. He has all this stuff going on. He's not much of a king. Biologically, he's not even 100% Jewish, right? There's one of the reasons why a lot of people, particularly the Jews, didn't like Herod, not to mention he was a bit of a despot and a bit of a crazy man, to be honest with you. He had his own son murdered. I believe he had a wife murdered. He was not a good guy at all. But he wanted to believe that he was the King of the Jews. And with that comes not only power, but prestige. And so when Herod hears these Magi arriving, seeking the King of the Jews, it's no wonder they first come to the man claiming to be the King of the Jews. But in their interaction with this guy, they discover, first of all, that Herod, like any Roman emperor and governor, doesn't like the sound of a king, because a person claimed to be a king may usurp them from their throne and take away their power. And so we see that Herod is obsessed with his position, his prestige, and his power. But the Magi are looking for the true King of Israel. So Herod goes through this process where he wants to eliminate this would-be usurper, even if it means murdering innocent children. And that is precisely what he does. And the Magi wise up to realize this guy may claim to be king, but he is no king at all. And so starting in verse 13, the story moves from the Magi and Herod to back to Joseph and his family. And there is Jesus as a toddler. And Joseph is told in the dream to go away, to run, and to flee to Egypt. In fact, Matthew reads there in verse 15, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. Right away, we are given a hint that Matthew is not just trying to convince us that Jesus is the King of the Jews. he's trying to tell us something else. He is simultaneously trying to show us that Jesus is a true and better Israel. That's to say that where Israel failed, Jesus triumphed. Where Israel disobeyed the law and disobeyed God, Christ triumphed. And so Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels, and he uses literary skill in order to illustrate this for us. So what we have then in the rest of this chapter is Herod goes and kills the children. So starting in verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all that region who were 2 years old or under. Now, immediately, our mind is to go to the past, right? And we're to think, I've read a story in the Bible about a despot murdering children. And of course, that story is Pharaoh, that when around the time Moses was born, he ordered all the Jewish male children, 2 and under, to be thrown into the Nile River. Thus, the Nile River becomes a literal river of blood, and which is one of the reasons why the first plague is blood, right? The Nile River and all the other water sources turn to blood. And it is out of that Moses is saved and delivers his people. So notice the story of Moses. Moses, his life is threatened by a despot who wants to murder children. And what does he do? He has to come out of Egypt, right? And then he is able to deliver his people. What is the story of Jesus? He, like Moses before him, is facing a despot who is willing to murder children to protect his throne. And he must come out of that in order to deliver his people. And so what we see here is not only does Jesus embody the story of Israel, Jesus is a type of Moses. He's a true and better Moses here. Yes, Moses prepared us for this prophet, and Matthew is saying that Jesus is the one that Moses had prepared us for, right? And so we clearly see the connection between Pharaoh and Herod, and Jesus and Moses. And that reference to Hosea is not a literal fulfillment in Jesus. Hosea wasn't thinking of the Messiah. Hosea was looking back, out of Egypt I call my son, looking back to the Exodus. But Matthew says that what God did to the people of Israel in the Exodus, he's about to do for us not through Moses, but through Jesus. And notice how it concludes. After a certain amount of time, Joseph leads his family back into the promised land. And the last verse of chapter 2 says, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. So think about the story of Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, he's not only presented as the promised king who brings with him a kingdom, but he is the fulfillment of all that the prophets had anticipated and the fulfillment of the vision God had for Israel. So think about it. He has to flee a despot king who's murdering babies. But before long, he comes to the promised land with a message about a kingdom. In chapter 3, we see another connection between Jesus and the Israelites, and that is the baptism of Jesus. Remember that, and not just the baptism, but the temptation of Jesus. So think about the story of the Exodus is after God redeems his people, they have to pass through the waters at the Red Sea, and they immediately go into the wilderness. So too Jesus, he passes through the waters of the Jordan River, but he doesn't go back into the promised land. He goes on the other end of the Jordan into the wilderness, not for 40 years, but for 40 days and 40 nights. And what is it that the Israelites find in the wilderness? They receive the law of God at Mount Sinai. What does Jesus do? He comes out of the wilderness, and what's the first thing Matthew tells us he does, starting in chapter 5? He goes to the top of a mountain, and there he gives the great Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. And you could keep going throughout this. It's not an accident that at the Transfiguration that we meet Moses and Elijah, because Jesus is true and better Elijah as well. And on and on and on it goes. So we see that not only is Jesus the King of the Jews, he is also a true and better Israel. He's the fulfillment of what Israel was to be. This is important for Matthew's first readers, and it's important for us, for understanding of who Jesus is and what he has accomplished. And also help us that when we go back to the Old Testament, we need to read it as it is, but also read it through the lens that Jesus has fulfilled all of this. Thus, our hope isn't in law, but in the Lord, who has redeemed us. He has saved us as King and as Savior. So Lord willing, tomorrow we'll look at Matthew chapter 3 and discuss the baptism. And a guy by the name of John, the Southern Baptist. See you guys.